Where do you think this fits into health? So this is clearly an important topic when we're talking about sports, right? When we're talking about endurance sports, like, running and cycling and swimming, the purpose of the sport is to be fast, is to have endurance and speed at that right combination. Many of the people listening to this podcast are no longer competing. You're still competing, but most people aren't. I don't compete at anything anymore. But I hate the term, but quote unquote cardio exercise or endurance-based exercise, we would still agree is still an important pillar of health. So how do you think about that? And more importantly, how do you think about what you've studied applying to health? And one of the things I want to talk about, because it's so interesting, of course, is at some point, does exercise become counterproductive? And maybe even what are the benefits specifically? For example, energetics, efficiency with metabolism, and how that can fight disease. So in any way you want to start that discussion, like how do you start to think about it, both scientifically and even personally?
Yeah, so that's a big bite to chew on. You've mapped out the next 3 hours of our conversation.
Yes.
So one thing I would say is, look, I don't want to oversell it and say you must understand, your absolute limits in order to be healthy. But I do think in terms of, if we think about the barriers to exercise, the barriers to being physically active, I think for a lot of people, if you interpret the distress signals you feel when you start exercising as signs that your body is reaching its limit, that's a very distressing thing. If you're like, I'm going to start an exercise program, I'm going to start brisk walking, I'm going to start running, and you feel you're panting, you're out of breath, your legs are burning, you're like, I'm going to die, and you stop. And so I think understanding that it's not so much about how to change your limits, but understanding what those limits represent, understanding that they are not signs that you're going to die. This is just information. And because I would say, and I haven't thought this through, maybe it's not true, but I would say off the top of my head, any meaningful form of exercise that's going to do you substantial amounts of good is going to involve dealing with discomfort in one form or another. And if you can get to a place where you understand that the feelings of discomfort are not signs that something is going wrong with your body, but they are just information. They are telling you where you are on the road to reaching your limits. And you don't have to go to your limits, but you also don't have to stop. You're allowed to just interpret that as information and say, okay, understood. I'm out of breath, but I can keep going. So I think, to me at least, that's a useful insight to take from this. Now, we can get deeper then into, you've raised some very interesting and controversial questions about, how much exercise is good. What kind of exercise do we need to do? I don't know where you want to start with that.
Well, because we don't have 3 hours, although when we meet in person and share a meal, we certainly will take those 3 hours. But let's start with two opposing points of view with respect to exercise. So one point of view says the exercise longevity curve is J-shaped. So at the far end of the spectrum, no exercise is a really bad thing for mortality. As you increase exercise, mortality improves, and then it kind of gets to your best all-cause mortality. And if you continue to increase exercising beyond a certain volume, this is generally discussed in volume of exercise, you actually see a little uptick in mortality, suggesting that once you go beyond a certain point, again, I want to stress this is in volume of exercise, you don't get any more benefit and you may actually have more harm. And a lot of times this is harm that comes in the form of cardiac dysrhythmia. It could be even atherosclerosis through endothelial damage, fibrosis, things like that. There's another body of literature that says, no, it's more or less a monotonically improving curve. And again, we all agree that at one end of the spectrum, having really poor cardiovascular fitness, again, we could measure this in VO2 max or something like that. As that improves and you get fitter and fitter and fitter and fitter, all-cause mortality goes lower and lower and lower, and there is no J to that curve. How do you think about reconciling those? And I want to point out at the outset, this is a discussion that only really impacts like 1% of the population, because 99% of the population are on the side of the curve where they could always benefit from exercising more. But, you, for example, might be one of those people who's in the 1% where, I don't know, what's your weekly mileage right now?
I fortunately, it's only probably about 20 miles. So
Okay.
so even James O'Keefe would give me a pass.
Yeah. So walk me through how you think about that, because I have to be honest with you. I've seen examples of, those athletes who go a little bit too far, who probably have a genetic susceptibility to dysrhythmia, and then they go on and get these dysrhythmias. But at the same time, they're few and far in between. So I'm still a bit on the fence about this one. Again, just purely from an intellectual standpoint, I don't think it applies to me anymore. It probably did at some point.
So it's a good question, and it's an important one. And there's a few things I want to say. First, I'm a runner, right? So take what I say, understand where I'm coming from. I'm also a human. Like, I don't want to die. So I try to look at this data as dispassionately as possible. So, but I obviously my knee-jerk reaction is like, let's find holes in this data that suggest running is bad. So I get that on the table. Second, there's no doubt that there is a reverse J curve. If you try to run 20 hours a day, it's not going to be good for you. So like nothing is good for you if you push it far enough. So the real question is, where do the extremes, or where does the uptick happen? Third thing I want to say is the data on this showing that, you do a little bit, you get some benefits, and the more you do, it gets worse and worse. One really interesting thing that came out of that, and there were a few studies about 8 years ago that showed that, is that actually the dose you need to get most of the health benefits is very small. And I do think that's an important message. You do not need to train or run marathons in order to be optimally healthy, at least to within the 90% or whatever. You're going to get most of what you get from a very modest amount of exercise. And so that's a great message. So, okay, now then,
can you quantify that, by the way, in terms of running? Let's put some numbers to that. If you're talking about a person who maybe was active in high school and college, but they're 10 or 20 years out of that, they've been caught up in the challenges of starting their career, starting their family, et cetera. They wake up, they're 40 years old, and their waist is 5 inches bigger. They've got metabolic syndrome. They're not in dire straits. It's not like they're going to die in the next 10 years, but they've got the message which says, hey, the one thing that is really missing is your exercise. What would you say if they came to you and said, Alex, just tell me the minimum effective dose. I don't want to run any weekend races. I like running. I used to love it, or rowing, or whatever their activity is. How many hours or how many miles do I need to do a week to just get the benefit, some of the benefit, 80% of the benefits with 20% of the efforts?
Yeah. So the Cooper Clinic study, which was like 50,000 people or so, that came out 4 or 5 years ago, their number was 5 to 10 minutes a day. I don't fully believe that, but that was their number. So you're talking like an hour a week. And that's just, going out for a run. I personally, maybe we can get into this. That's not my definition of an optimal exercise routine. I would include some high intensity stuff, and strength is another thing. But so there's making some claims about a very, very low minimum effective dose. Personally, I would say, so like I said, I'm probably running about 20 miles a week right now, which is 6 days a week, half an hour with a couple of hard days. I think that's to me, that's on the low end of I think I would be healthier if I did more at this point. And it's just
you think you would actually be healthier? I know you'd be a better runner, but would you be would you live longer?
I think I would. Now, I think if I had to, the first thing I would do, if I had instant motivation powder that I was going to dust on myself, I would up my strength my strength training routine. That would be the first thing I do if longevity was my first priority.
Oh, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. So you wouldn't necessarily run more. You would take extra time and add it in the weight room or do something else?
No, I would run more.
Okay.
Like if I was prioritizing, I would prioritize strength first.
Okay.
But I think if I also changed, I think for me, because I'm come from a background where I'm already I'm used to running. 20 miles a week doesn't stress me very much. It just slows down my decline. I think I could benefit from, let's say, one longer run a week or something like that. This is a gut feeling.
Yep.
Let's not, I don't want to, this is not supported by anything other than my gut. But so the 5 to 10 minutes a day, it's definitely the right place to start if you're the 45-year-old, sedentary, getting back into it. But I think you might want to push something a little higher than that. Or certainly if you're doing 60 minutes a week, I wouldn't do it in 5 to 10 minute chunks. I would do some 20-minute chunks or whatever.
And what do we know about injury prevention in that person?
That probably they're going to get injured because they're going to find that no matter how metabolically unfit they are, they're probably going to find that they gain metabolic fitness more quickly than they gain tendon stiffness and muscle strength and things like that. So in a sense, that's even more reason to sort of take that guideline seriously. I'm talking about running, which, because I love, you're less likely to get injured if you go cycling or something like that. That's obviously, there's other ways of mitigating the injury thing. But yeah, but let me just cast some doubt on the J-shape thing. There were two main studies on which this whole J-curve hypothesis was founded. One was the Copenhagen study, and one was the Cooper Clinic study. The Copenhagen study, initially it came out saying running is great and more running is better. And then they reanalyzed it with a new co-author, and they concluded that running too much or too fast was bad. That was based on there were 2 deaths in the group that ran too fast. Like, this is not, the confidence interval was essentially infinite. But there's a more serious problem, and it's one that affects the Cooper Clinic data too, which is that when you have a big study of 50,000 people who were just randomly selected, they're not all the same. They all have different characteristics. So you have to find some way of adjusting for various characteristics. And without going too far down the rabbit hole, basically, they statistically adjusted, initially at least, for things like cholesterol levels, weight, blood sugar levels, blood pressure, because you want to, it's meaningless if you compare, like, we had this, the non-runners died sooner than the runners, but they were also 20 pounds heavier and had all these other risk factors. So you want to equalize it. But there's a problem that if you equalize it, you're essentially saying, well, what are the health benefits of exercise if you don't do any exercise? Because the health benefits of exercise are precisely in helping you regulate things like blood pressure and blood sugar, and controversially, but I would say weight also. So essentially, to me, that was statistical misconduct. Like that. So you're saying if you take the people who exercise and you basically penalize them for having lower weight, better lipids, better blood sugar, better blood pressure. So you bring them in line so that they're just as overweight and just have all the other risk factors. Then you see this J-curve. Now, when they actually published the data in a peer-reviewed journal 2 years after it was presented, they'd eliminated that statistical method, and the J-curve had disappeared. You no longer saw the J-curve. Now, I don't want to just dismiss and say, well, therefore there's nothing to see. I'm just saying that if we're talking about where the curve happens, if you do that kind of statistical adjustment, which is the equivalent of saying, like, I want to know whether smoking causes cancer, but I can't compare the smokers and non-smokers because the smokers have more lung cancer. So let's artificially equalize it and pretend that the smokers just have just as much cancer. That you can't, basically in statistical terms, you can't adjust for a mediating variable, a variable that's affected by the thing you're trying to measure. So, sorry,
No.
As you can tell, this is a topic I get excited about.
No, it
so
is, and I've read what you've written about it, which is why I wanted to bring it up. I have a slightly different take on it, which is less about everything you've said and more of the practical issue, because the practical issue is the one I get asked about a lot, which is, am I exercising too much, right? This is the person asking the question. And so again, let's pause it for a moment that 99% of people are not exercising too much and don't even possess the fortitude to exercise too much, right? They don't, the pain tolerance isn't there. The obsession with exercise isn't there. So for 99% of people, we'd like to get them to exercise more or stay the same. We're dealing with 1% of the population, many of whom I know and one of whom I used to be, that were kind of the hyper exercisers. Here's the bigger point I would make. It's probably less relevant whether or not they're spending too many hours cycling, swimming, running, etc. Usually people in this sense, it's not the number of hours they're spending, it's the portfolio allocation of how they're spending it that's the bigger problem. It's that they're not well-rounded and they're not actually in pursuit of longevity. So the reality of it is training for the Tour de France going to increase your longevity? Absolutely not. No way. Like, those guys finish the Tour anemic, osteopenic, their upper bodies are emaciated, their posture is horrible. There's nothing about that that is setting you up to be an octogenarian that kicks ass. Nothing whatsoever. So they're physiologic marvels, but their health span sucks, right? So that's using that as an extreme. How would we extrapolate that to the 40-year-old who just can't hang up the dreams of being a professional athlete, who's out there, running or riding or doing all of that stuff nonstop, but at the expense of maybe not doing some Pilates to work on core strength. I hate the term, but you know what, just for people to understand what I'm saying, like not working on stability, not spending any time in the weight room, really working on strength, not varying the intensity of their workouts to work different energy systems. So to me, that's the bigger issue with people who are exercising too much. It's probably not that they're at that little tip of a J that may or may not exist. It's that they're squandering their time. It's like having all of this money, but you're invested. You have a lousy portfolio.
Yeah. Okay. I agree with a lot of that. One thing I'll say is the important question you're implicitly asking there is, what's your goal, right? Like what are you training for?
Well, that's what I said. Longevity. This was all predicated towards living a longer, healthier life, and meaning, not winning races or whatever.
I would 100% agree. If someone comes to me and says, I want to optimize my exercise program for longevity, like I said before, there's no way I would tell them you should be training for a marathon. That's not because I think training for a marathon is bad, but like you said, it's an opportunity cost of other things you could be doing, that a lot of other things you could be doing that would probably work better. So I think it's really important to disabuse people of the notion that in order to optimize your health, you should run a marathon. But where I bridle with this sort of the media coverage of that stream of research is that's different from saying that people who are training for a marathon because they want to run a marathon or because they want to run a marathon as fast as possible should stop because that's bad. So it's like of the category of people who have unhealthy behaviors who we should intervene to save them from themselves, it's like people who are training for a marathon to me are not even close to being in the same category as people like me who are sitting at a desk for 8 hours a day or whatever the case may be. So it's like there's a difference between optimizing and avoiding like serious problems. And the one other thing I should acknowledge is, and you alluded to it, is there are other potential issues with lots of endurance training, and arrhythmias is one of them. And there's better evidence that that's a real thing. So, like there may be a price, there may be downsides to training really hard. On balance, overall, I would say I don't lie awake at night worrying about people who are running 50 miles a week.
Yeah, you're right. You should worry far more about people who are eating poorly, smoking, who are stressed out of their minds and don't have coping mechanisms for them. Yeah, there's not many people that you should be worrying about more or less rather. Yeah.
And if I think of the people I know who let's say run the equivalent of 50 miles a week or more, I can't think of any of them who would say, I'm doing this because I think this is what I need in order to optimize my health span or lifespan. They obviously hope it's healthy, but I think if you're training for a marathon, most of them are doing it for competition. Or not, self-competition in a way. And it sort of reminds me of some, you discussed this a little bit, I think, in your conversation with James O'Keefe, the sort of what's great about tennis and badminton and volleyball or whatever. What's the social element of it? And I think, sure, on average, running is a solitary sport. But for me, it's my primary social outlet. It's where I meet my friends. It's where I, get together and catch up on the week on an easy run. So it's like, I think that's true for a lot of people who, once you get into that 50 miles a week, not for everyone, but for a lot of people, it's a social element. It's pleasurable. It's a stress reliever. So it goes beyond the if you take that away, I'm not sure it nets out as positive.
This podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions. Finally, I take conflicts of interest very seriously. For all of my disclosures and the companies I invest in or advise, please visit peteratiamd.com/about, where I keep an up-to-date and active list of such companies.